again, the difference on how we read the idea of like breaking down from a sort of translation perspective or like a cultural context perspective. My interpretation of what they have meant through these videos of breaking down is like more of a, like, I think in English, when we talk about breaking down, we usually talk about like a moment. I broke down last night. Or like maybe I had, like, somebody had a panic attack, right? Like they really broke down in front of me. But I think when they've been talking about it in these two kids' rooms, the impression I've gotten is that they are talking a little bit more about like ongoing mental distress, like an ongoing sort of dysregulative pattern or ongoing stressors or like a significant event over a span of time rather than like a singular event that you could point to once. So, you know, even if you're talking about like, yeah, Ian broke down in the English sense for XYZ reason, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that he had like a month and a half of deep emotional dysregulation from it. I think there's also, it's interesting that he brings up the word crumbled. So in mental health, we'll sometimes we'll refer to like recovery journeys. This is pretty common in like any type of thing that we would talk about in recovery. So maybe substance use, maybe eating disorders, maybe you know, I like kind of deep what might be referred to by some people as like a nervous breakdown, or, you know, any type of thing that we would think about like we are recovering from a situation. There's sort of like a curve of recovery. And one part of that curve can include something called collapse. And that's when, like, within a recovery process, there might be, like, regression. There might be, like, it's normal to not just go up, and just, like, always be getting better all of the time. But a collapse is when people, like, really, they fall below baseline, or they fall really far behind. Maybe they even get worse than they were, you know, initially. You know, all sort of like all of the coping mechanisms, as stated, collapse. So I think it's just sort of interesting, like, this idea of, like, you've never actually crumbled. Because I do think that, like, he is unintentionally referring to this sort of, like, the emotional roller coaster of mental illness, essentially, or of mental health concerns that can happen that's really far beyond just, like, what a night or a week or a season might look like, but instead what longer term changes in our outlooks can look like, you know?
무너진 적은 없었거든. 근데 이제 그러다가 한 번 무너지면 그렇게 괜찮게 살아왔던 정리가 무너져? 할 것 같아.
And the thing is that is completely possible, right? People do go through horrific traumas that can result in, you know, that's what PTSD can be, right? As people become older without significant like capital T trauma, you know, the types of things that would create PTSD or complex PTSD, or, you know, other types of mental health difficulties, The longer people go without those types of situations as they grow up, the more internal and external resources they have to protect themselves from a, sudden collapse. Because they have a stronger sense of self, they have more community support, right? They have usually more monetary support, they have more independence, all kinds of things. So it becomes less likely, it is much less likely that somebody who goes through a severe trauma, like their first severe trauma resulting in long-term difficulties, they go through that for the first time when they are 32, is going to end up like with deep health concerns from it than somebody who goes through their first, capital T trauma when they are 14, right? Well, one of those people has way more resilience and fortitude to be able to handle that. That certainly doesn't mean that it's impossible, and certainly doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And everybody will go through some amount of trauma at some point. That's just like the human condition. How well we recover from it. And in fact, when we think about PTSD, there's a few different modalities that considers it as a problem of recovery, not the problem of symptoms themselves. So when any type of trauma happens to us, or anything that we sort of take as trauma, we will have some amount of PTSD symptoms. Everybody will. It's just, if things are not handled appropriately, if there's not appropriate resources to manage those symptoms, they may perpetuate, and it's the continuation of the symptoms and them either getting worse or having no relief from them that is what PTSD or complex PTSD really is based in. But we anticipate that, if somebody really close to you passes away, you're going to have symptoms that are essentially PTSD for a period of time. That is a normal response. That is our expected response. So it's completely possible that people who have been very stable and, very supported throughout and very, mostly mentally well throughout most of their life, something happens and it causes a cascade effect that can result in, a larger collapse or breakdown. There are also some mental health issues that don't necessarily come to the forefront until 20s, 30s. Sometimes it's not as common, but there are certain things that sometimes we don't see them really come up until later in life. So that's another thing that can happen, is that there are some mental illnesses and mental health concerns that, have some amount of genetic component, have some amount of familial component, that have a multitudes of components, but we don't really see them until much later on in life.
제법 잘 살았구만. 다행이네. 생각이 깊다고 생각.
My final thought on that also, though, is that they're talking in comparison to other people they know. So this is another part of it, is that if in societies where, certain things are stigmatized and there is some amount of mental illness or mental health concern that is considered part of the human condition, then people can seem a lot more stable than they maybe have actually been. So for instance, okay, we see this a lot with conversations about food, right? And idol culture with diet culture and things like that, is people being like, well, idols are making those decisions for themselves, so we have no place to have thoughts or opinions on it. and, I have concerns about the way that people on all sides of the conversation talk about these things. But the fact of the matter is that, like, disordered eating is sort of considered part of the job of an idol. That, like, just the fundamental base expectation is an amount of disorder in and of itself. So how would people in that circumstance be able to make realistic understanding of other people's behaviors and if it's healthy or not when the very base level is already right? This is kind of like the Overton window. We can get an Overton window of mental health concerns where, if you don't know what the Overton window is, it's a political concept wherein we have an expectation of what is normal and understood and, like, what is reasonable. A lot of times the Overton window is talked about in, like, the rise of, like, authoritarianism in different political systems. And part of what happens is you normalize over time antisocial behavior and antisocial legislation, and it moves our Overton window of the expectations. So, like, in the United States, we talk about how our political Overton window is very far right, wherein our idea of what liberal is actually in many places sort of like moderate conservatism. But our Overton window is pretty narrow to the right. So a lot of people here don't understand that, like, our liberalism is not what liberalism is in a lot of other places, and certainly isn't what leftism is in a lot of other places. This is a little bit of the Overton window of mental health, right? If you sort of expect that everybody has anxiety, right? Like, everybody just feels bad all the time, that life is suffering. I hear this a lot from people whose parents are like, well, yeah, you just feel bad while you're alive. So, like, what are you complaining about? There's a lot of people who just think that leading a successful life is being kind of miserable all the time, which doesn't have to be the case. But when that's your Overton window of, like, well, yeah, everybody is, like, kind of stressed and sometimes has panic attacks. I'm not saying that is what the Overton window is. Like, this is just, like, an example. But if that's where your expectation is, your idea of who is steady and stable, they might not actually be, like, completely well. They might just be the healthiest person you know. That doesn't mean they are, in fact, like, super healthy, right? So that's the other caveat here.